So let's move on to this week's big literary scandal. This is the story about Kate Clanchy, who is essentially being forced to rewrite her book. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about this?
It just reminds me of that Ray Bradbury quote about there's more than one way to burn a book. And I think this is the perfect example of this. So Kate Clanchy, she wrote this book, published in 2019, Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me. It's a kind of memoir talking about her time teaching in an Oxford comprehensive, her working with the pupils and teaching them how to write poetry and all this kind of stuff, and was widely praised at the time. It won the Orwell Prize, again, was widely celebrated. And basically in recent weeks, it seems like a few people on Goodreads and on Twitter have started to claim that it's racist, basically, and ableist. There's a handful of quotes, largely descriptions of ethnic minority students, references to chocolate-coloured skin, almond-shaped eyes, with the autistic students saying that they were unself-consciously odd and jarring company. A few things like this kind of wrenched out of all context. You know, the worst you can say about those lines is they're probably not strictly politically correct in the way that things talk about these days, maybe a bit hackneyed and cliched, but certainly not racist and bigoted in intent. That's pretty obvious. And what's not surprising here is not that a handful of people on Goodreads got upset about something. That's par for the course. Of course, people get offended by things all the time. It's a pastime for a lot of people these days. What's strange, as ever, is why anyone is listening to these people. So Picador, her publisher, have issued not one but two apology statements so far, one of which saying that they were going to update it for the next edition, and the other one basically apologising for how weak the first statement was, apologising for all the hurt that had been caused, etc. Kate Clanchy herself originally stood up for herself a little bit and has now backed down, said that she's listening, she's going to get the chance to rewrite it. At one point she even says, "I am not a good person," as if she wasn't laying it on thick enough.
Serious grovelling.
Yeah, it's very, very weird. Philip Pullman, an interesting character in the culture in his own right, but who defended her and then slightly complicated story, but essentially backed down and then put out a statement saying, again, kind of apologising for the hurt that he himself had caused. We can tweet about why Boris Johnson should be hanging from a lamppost and not think any of it, but, again, just defending someone who was being unfairly attacked is a bridge too far, apparently. And it's just that striking way through which we might not have a kind of old-fashioned book burnings anymore, or book censorship certainly, but mobs and institutional cowardice can certainly get you at least half of the way there, it feels like at the moment.
I mean, the thing about the comments is, and Jo Williams mentions this in her column for Spike this week, that she says the point of the book is that it's actually kind of drippingly liberal. Yeah. It's like a, love letter to these kids. And if you were going to take offense at anything in the book, it was this kind of like semi-patronizing view that this sort of, a teacher comes along and who decides that she's going to sort of examine her pupils, and this kind of very liberal idea that kids can teach us as much as we can teach kids, and yada, yada, yada. And so the sort of the comments, particularly about the autistic kids, about her finding their company jarring, as Jo says, reveals something more about herself and her personality than it does about any societal view of how we would treat autistic kids.
We should also say she's so self-effacing. I think in the book itself, she talks about her concerns that she is just this liberal, posh do-gooder and stuff. So so privilege checking this individual as well.
Yeah,
so.
And so, and in the context of a book that has to be said, not a kind of million years ago, not back in the time, dustbin of history, but relatively recently won awards, won acolytes, was praised and reviewed by people.
It was only last year that it got the Orwell Prize. It was published in 2019, the 2020 Orwell Prize.
Shows that this is not a kind of, a natural change in society, thinking differently about the way in which we talk about minorities or people with a learning disability or otherwise. It's about a shift in the, as Tom says, the kind of shrill nature of the debate around this. I think, whatever about Clanchy kind of initially saying, I didn't say those things, perhaps kind of in a panic, and then afterwards making this grovelling apology, I have limited sympathy for her. But what I think is kind of 60% of the problem is kind of censors saying you can't publish this. But the rest of the 40% of the problem is people like Philip Pullman and publishers taking a very cowardly line when it comes to this kind of stuff, and not accepting their responsibility of people who can change the discussion around censorship, particularly in the world of literature. Because it's getting to the point now where an author is going to have to jump through so many hoops and check so many things and have sensitivity readers and all the rest of it before their stuff can get published, which means that the world of literature is going to become incredibly narrowed and incredibly politically constrained. And if Philip Pullman, with all his sort of, whatever it is, I don't know what his net worth is, but he's a very wealthy man, very well connected, as Tom said, says, very used to slagging people off on Twitter, has a large following, doesn't have the balls to stand up for someone when he really believes it, and then gets kind of this sort of robotic kind of statement saying, I retract my statement, which was definitely written by somebody else, then you think, oh, you're part of the problem. It's going to start taking some people to step forward, and like Lionel Shriver or some other authors who we know well and have done this, to say, whatever about my reputation, whatever about my book sales, this is something politically that's worth standing up for. We need to have more people like that and less cowards like Coleman and Clanchy.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, there've been so many kind of literary scandals over the past couple of years to do with the culture wars, particularly around race and stuff, and you do sort of wonder, is the liberal book world full of racists, or is it that they're just hypersensitive to all this stuff?
They just discovered one book they published 2 years ago, and they've now found it. It just shows how much the kind of Overton window shifted with this stuff, I guess, or how much institutional cowardice has grown. I mean, some of the accusations being thrown Clanchy's way are so ridiculous. I mean, the BBC story on this quoted a few kind of ethnic minority authors, and one of them was saying that the book is almost unsavable, uneditable in that sense, because it's rooted in racism and phrenology. Why are you listening to these people? These people are crazy, as far as I'm concerned, but unfortunately they do rule the roost, or they nevertheless can exert influence over these cowardly publishing houses.